Hello, welcome back to another episode of Embracing Data. I'm Marian Vidal-Fernandez, and today I have the pleasure to be chatting with Rebecca Taylor. Rebecca is an assistant professor of economics at Urbana-Champaign. Before moving back to the US, Rebecca was a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on measuring the impacts of environmental regulation on consumer behavior. Rebecca, welcome to Embracing Data, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Rebecca has worked on a range of very interesting topics. For example, she has studied the impact of plastic ban policies on plastic waste or the relationship between plastic trade and ocean plastic pollution. What makes you, as an economist, interested in looking at the impact of environmental policies on consumer behavior?
Well, my interest in environmental policy started at a very young age. My dad is a summer camp director, and part of what he did every week, he would get all of the campers together. We would line up and we would walk through camp picking up all of the litter that we found. And this really just showed me one, just the amount of waste and litter that we as consumers generate, the different kinds of litter, but also how, individual action can be done to reduce litter. And so this really started my research agenda, thinking about consumer behavior and waste.
This is great, great story. It still applies, now with our kids, how we can teach them to take care of what matters around us and for other generations to come. Now I move to your research and your work that embraces data, survey and administrative data, to dive into the link between environmental policies and consumer behavior. In particular, I'd like to focus on your co-authored paper with a very catchy title, If You Build It, Will They Compost? The Effects of Municipal Composting Services on Household Waste Disposal and Landfill Emissions. We try to unpack this paper today together. Specifically, it looks into how offering a convenient way to dispose compostable waste in New South Wales impacts waste disposal behavior. What are the economic benefits of composting?
There's actually several benefits of composting organic waste over sending it to, say, landfill. A big one that we focus on in this paper is the fact that composting organic waste generates a lot less methane, which is a type of greenhouse gas, than landfilling organic waste. Landfills actually are the third largest source of human-caused methane emissions. And so this is a big benefit. By composting, we are able to reduce our greenhouse gas impacts. Other benefits, though, include expanding or extending the lifespan of landfills. Sending less waste to landfills mean the landfills last longer. Also, generating compost can be used to reduce chemical fertilizers that are put on, agricultural fields. And these are just a couple of the benefits that we get from composting.
So basically, if we are not composting now, we should all just start composting if we care about the environment and worried about global warming.
Yeah, especially if you have curbside compost available, which is, makes it really convenient. You're not having to compost in your backyard. Definitely take advantage of it.
Yeah, I just wish that those of us who live in apartments also would have that option. I guess it will come eventually, a bit slow, but it will get there. And you now live in the US. Here in Australia, from your research, how do you think it compares to other countries in terms of composting take-up?
Yeah, great question. So Australia has been actively promoting council level compost programs over the last 15 years. So there's been a really big expansion during that time period. In 2023, it was estimated that 25% of councils were offering curbside compost collection for food and garden waste. Compared to other countries, this is pretty similar to what we see in the European Union. And it's higher than what we're seeing in the US, where the rate is more around 12%.
Okay, so we're on the right track, but I guess we could always do a bit better. But it's good to know that we are up with the highest composting level countries. That's kind of hopeful. And going back to your paper, it looks at how council provision of curbside composting services, so the green bin, impacts how much waste is going to landfill, how much waste is generated in total, and other types of recycling. Let's unpack these. In New South Wales, there are two composting systems, FOGO and GO. FOGO is a curbside collection service that allows food to be added to the green lid garden waste bin so that it can be also recycled into compost. Then GO is just garden organic. Currently, 70 councils in New South Wales have adopted FOGO. It makes sense that offering a green bin will increase the amount of composting. But why would composting impact the recycling of other things such as paper or plastic?
Well, we started with looking at how the compost, the green bins, impacted what was going into the red bin as sort of a direct substitution. But we also wanted to look at not just the direct impact of having a green bin, we also wanted to see if there were spillover effects, especially spillover effects on very similar behaviors, putting recycling waste into the yellow bin, for instance, or just the total amount of waste that a household generates. And so a couple of reasons why we might think there could be spillover effects. For one, when you are sorting your organic waste out of, say, a plastic container, you're scraping out your leftover food into the green bin. You've now just cleaned this plastic container, which you could put into the yellow bin. And so we might actually see that there are these sort of positive spillover effects of sorting organic waste and sorting other recyclables. But at the same time, we could also expect potentially the opposite effect, where you have limited time, limited energy. Once you've had to sort one type of material, you might have less time and energy to sort the other. So we really weren't sure before the study whether we would see a positive or a negative effect on the yellow bin. We were also interested in the total waste because there was this concern before the policies were implemented that by offering a third bin, we would see an increase in the total amount of waste generated by households. Having a third bin would just mean you have more space, more room to dispose of waste, and thus there could be an increase. And so we also wanted to look at the total amount of waste that households were generating to really get the full picture of how this program was affecting household behavior.
This is great. You're basically looking at what is the impact of adding an alternative of recycling food waste in this case, not only on the amount of food waste that's being not going to landfill, but also your behavior in respect to other types of recycling, as well as food waste producing. And that really gives you a big picture of how one thing can have an impact on the whole behavior of the consumer in regards to waste generation. Now, in order to answer this question, what data did you use?
We were really fortunate to learn about this publicly available data from the New South Wales EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. This data is called the Local Government Waste and Resource Recovery Reports, or WAR for short. And this data has information on all councils in New South Wales, the amount of waste going to red bin, yellow bin, and green bin. And they provided averages that were at the household by week level. So really rich data and great for us in that it was publicly available for us to use. We then merged this with additional publicly available data, such as sociodemographic information from the ABS.
That sounds like the ideal data to answer this question. Your paper was published recently. Why did you stop the sample timeframe in 2015?
Part of the reason we stopped our sample period in 2016 was because of the big disruption in the waste industry that happened in 2017. The big disruption happened because China implemented a ban on importing plastic waste into China. And so they no longer were taking plastic waste from other countries. And this meant countries like Australia that had been exporting their waste to China had to recalibrate and figure out what they were going to do with that waste. And so there was a time period where the waste system was very disrupted. Studies are suggesting now that was just a couple years long and that we're sort of back to a sort of new normal, but we do end our sample period to try to avoid the confounders that happened when China passed their import ban.
So now going back to this policy. So some councils had already adopted compost waste collections before 2008. Do you then compare the average landfill and waste generated between households in councils with and without those green bins?
Well, if we did that, if we compared, say, the difference between councils that adopt green bins and councils that didn't adopt green bins, we would be concerned that we could be picking up other factors that are driving the differences. So, for instance, it could be that green bin adopting councils on average have larger households, larger houses. They generate more waste on average than, say, the non-adopters. We would end up conflating this difference in waste to, the policy change when actually it's just that these councils happen to be different. We call this omitted variable bias. There could be another form of omitted variable bias. For instance, if we were to naively just compare councils that adopt green bins to themselves, but before the policy change, we might conflate events that happened at the same time. So for instance, it could have been a really, really rainy year, the year that a council adopts a green bin. And if it's really rainy, there's a lot more garden waste. It grows with the rain. And so we could accidentally pick up this difference, before and after, but it's really due to the rain and not due to the policy. And so we're worried with these simple differences that we're not capturing omitted variable.
So how do you do it? How do you avoid omitted variable bias then?
Yeah, well, instead of just comparing the green bin adopters to the non-adopters, we're going to look at the green bin adopters before and after the policy, and then compare them to the non-adopters before and after the policy. This gives us a difference in difference estimate. We're looking at two differences and comparing them. So it's the difference pre and post for the adopters minus the difference pre and post for the non-adopters. And the reason we do it is that it cancels out the unobserved factors within councils, such as household size, and it also cancels out the unobserved factors that affected all councils at the same time, such as a rain shock happening.
And is it the staggered differences in differences method bulletproof? Does it allow you to measure the true impact of composting on landfill reduction?
Difference in differences and staggered difference in differences is a very powerful tool, but it relies on making strong assumptions. And we call the assumption the parallel trend assumption. This assumption basically says that in the absence of treatment, in our case, green bin adoption, so in the absence of green bin adoption, within every period, the change in waste behavior would have been the same for treated, not yet treated, and never treated councils. In other words, this whole assumption basically boils down to we need to assume that our control councils are a good counterfactual for our treated councils. That if our treated councils hadn't gone in a green bin, their waste would have trended the same as the control councils.
Can you please give an example of a hypothetical case in which this parallel trends assumption might be violated?
So an example where we might have a violation of the parallel trends assumption is, say, what if the green bin adopters happen to be councils that were growing in population, that there were more and more people coming, and so their trend of household waste looks really different than those that don't adopt. Well, if we didn't have parallel trends in that pre-policy period, it would be hard to assume that they would trend the same afterwards. And so we'd be concerned that these control councils aren't really a good counterfactual for the treated councils because their population is growing in a very different way.
So I guess that one thing to bear in mind when doing staggered differences in differences is then to account for all these other elements that change over time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the reason that in addition to our sort of main model, we also include control variables that varied across both councils and over years. For instance, we do control for the average population size and the average GDP of councils over time. for that reason that we want to reduce these other confounders that could be happening.
So let's stop being the identification police and go back to your results. Statistically, what is the impact of green beans on landfill waste, recycling, and composting as you find them in your paper?
Yes, so we find that green bin adoption led to a roughly 4 kilogram per household per week reduction in red bin waste and an equivalent 4 kilogram increase in green bin waste. This translates to roughly 1/4 of the household waste that was going to landfill going to composting instead. And so that was the main direct effect we're looking at. When we look at the spillover effects on the yellow bins, we do find a slight decrease of waste going into the yellow bin after green bin adoption, but this result isn't particularly robust to all the specifications. We can reject a large positive effect, but it could be that, it's almost a null effect. It's almost not statistically significant. So potentially a small negative effect on recycling, but not one that's particularly large. We also look at total waste, and for total waste, we're not finding an effect. Basically, the reduction in landfill is perfectly offset with an increase in the green bin. And so this is reassuring to the policymakers who are worried that the third bin might increase total waste. We don't find that.
So this is good news in terms of the impact of the policy. And at the start of the podcast, you mentioned why we should care about the reduction of land waste. Now, what does this involve in terms of reduction of landfill emissions?
Yes, so our big motivating fact was that landfills are a large source of greenhouse gas emissions. In many countries, including Australia. And so we took our estimates for the reduction in landfill waste from the green bin adoption, and we calculate that a statewide program would reduce landfill waste by 671,000 tons per year. With that value and some conversion factors, we're able to estimate that green bin adoption would reduce greenhouse gas emissions from landfills from 6 to 26%.
And this is only in New South Wales, right?
This is just for New South Wales.
Wow. So imagine if we calculated that for the rest of Australia or the rest of the world. It could be a massive improvement.
Yes.
Now, a follow-up question is this improvement short or long-lived? This effect persist over time, or did the novelty fade off after a while?
We found that these results were very persistent. They persisted up to 6 years after green bin adoption, which was the extent of our sample period. So the results persisted for as much data as we had. So we did not see the novelty fading off. If anything, households continue to use their green bins over time.
That's great news as well. And now thinking about other policies that have been implemented by councils with a similar objective, such as providing kitchen caddies to put your waste into the caddy before going out, or giving penalties if you contaminate a bin and put waste in the bin that should not be at, and also information about the benefits of composting and the uses of compost soil. How do you think these policies interact with the green bins policy?
We think these additional council level activities would make green bin programs more effective. That said, we weren't able to collect information for all the councils across every year for when they were doing these activities. We found evidence that they were doing all these things, but not a complete data set. And so we think a great area for future research would be to collect more data on which councils and when they are doing these additional activities to see if they're, having an additional effect on the green bin adoption effectiveness.
This is great for all students listening out there. Take advantage of this research opportunity and in a very important topic. In your data, you did not have information about exactly what was being dumped in each type of council bin. What other questions could you have answered if you had that information?
So if we had information on exactly what was in each bin, we could have looked at additional questions. A big concern in the waste management literature is this concept called contamination. The green bin can get contaminated with items that aren't compostable. The yellow bin can get contaminated with items that aren't recyclable. This is a big cost to councils in operating their recycling and composting facilities. With the data we have, we know how much goes into each bin, but we don't know what the contents were. And so there's a lot more questions that we could potentially answer if we knew exactly what was in the bins. It is pretty time intensive to collect this data. You do bin audits, which means you randomly go to households, you dump their waste onto a tarp, and you see all the different things that they throw away and you itemize it. And so you can imagine this is a big data collection effort. And so it's not done that often. It's usually done every couple of years by councils. And so having that data at a much higher frequency would lead to a lot of really interesting questions. And there are some firms right now that are developing sort of AI technology to take pictures of the top of a bin. Like you open up the lid, take a picture, and it would be able to, diagnose what exactly is in that bin, at least in that top layer. So I foresee there being more information on what goes in the bins in the future, but this was not the data we had for this project. One thing we haven't talked about yet, but that's talked about in the paper, is that green bins could be just for garden waste, or they could be for garden waste and food waste. And one thing we can't really disentangle is for those bins that can have both, the FOGO bins, food and garden waste, how much of the bin is food waste and how much of the bin is garden waste. And so I think in particular, when we're thinking about whether garden waste programs or food and garden waste programs are the way to go, having that additional information would be helpful.
It's always like that, right? The more data you have, the more you can dive into the whys of a question. So let's move to more general data insights. What was the most challenging obstacle that you faced in this project, or generally when doing research?
Yeah, well, this project happened during a lot of change within the differences econometric literature. There were a lot of papers coming out about how the methods that had been using had a potential for bias and proposing new estimation strategies. And so that was definitely a challenge while we were working on this, just to, be up to date, to be doing the sort of most robust methods that we could be confident in our results, not having this potential bias. And so that was an interesting challenge that just, happened to happen while we were working on this project.
Now, what was the most rewarding aspect of the research that you did?
The most rewarding aspect was getting to discuss the results with policymakers, with news outlets, and seeing the results make an impact, seeing the, FOGO program, the green bin programs continue to be adopted in New South Wales, and sort of seeing them adopted in other parts of the world as well. And so that's a really rewarding aspect of doing research, making an impact.
Congratulations, Rebecca. It's great to hear that academic research is having a policy impact on important topics like the ones you're working on, such as the environment and climate change. Based on your experience, how has data been useful in your everyday life?
I find data to be fun. I get a lot of personal enjoyment out of data analysis, making cool data visualization graphs. But more generally, I have found data to be helpful in making decisions. Even just everyday decisions, having data helps me weigh the costs and the benefits of a decision. Decisions similar to the kinds of decisions that I research, like whether or not to compost. Having curbside compost collection lowers the time cost of composting my waste, which makes it easier for me to make decisions to compost. And I hope that the data that I'm providing here, sort of shows the benefit side of that decision, that it's going to reduce, greenhouse gas emissions from landfill.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for taking us along on this environmental journey. We've come to an end, and for sharing how you embrace data to answer a very policy relevant question.
Thanks, Marian. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation.